In the spring of 1851, on a quiet Georgia plantation, there was one cabin no overseer liked to enter alone. From the outside, it looked no different from the others. Rough wood, a low door, no windows worth mentioning. But when the woman who lived inside disappeared, that door was finally forced open. And what waited inside stopped everyone in the room cold. This was not something meant to be seen, not something written down, and certainly not something the plantation ever intended to explain. Hidden beneath the floorboards, tucked into places no one thought to search, were traces of a life that contradicted everything they believed about her, about the cabin, and about the system that held her there. Each discovery raised more questions than answers, questions that even today historians still argue over. Tonight, we're uncovering what was found inside a female slave's cabin in Georgia in 1851, piece by piece, and why the truth was quietly buried for generations. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you value forgotten history brought to light, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's go back to that cabin. In the summer of 1851, a plantation overseer in rural Georgia made a discovery that would challenge everything the community believed about the woman who lived in a small cabin at the edge of the property. Her name was Aura, and she was enslaved. But what investigators found hidden within the walls, beneath the floorboards, and concealed in spaces no one thought to look, revealed a life far more complex than anyone could have imagined. This is not a story about freedom easily won or resistance openly displayed. This is the account of secrets preserved in the most unlikely of places, and the silent testimony of objects that refuse to be forgotten. The cabin itself was remarkable. Even by the standards of a plantation estate in antebellum Georgia, it stood out. The wooden structure had been carefully maintained, painted white with a brick chimney that rose straight and true. The windows, small as they were, had been fitted with actual glass rather than the oiled paper that graced most slave quarters. There was a wooden porch elevated above the ground, and the door itself was solid oak with working hinges that moved without protest. To any visitor who passed by, the cabin seemed almost intentional in its presentation, as though someone had taken great care in constructing not just shelter, but something that approached the appearance of dignity. The surrounding grounds told their own story. Unlike the typical arrangements of plantation cabins, which were often clustered together in rows for easier supervision, Aura's cabin stood isolated on the western edge of the property. It was separated from the main house by nearly 300 yards, screened by a grove of live oak trees whose branches twisted and intertwined overhead. This distance was not accidental. The plantation owner, a man named Samuel Blackwood, had deliberately chosen this location when he brought Aura to the property 7 years earlier. The overseer's logs from that time noted only that she was to be kept separate from the other enslaved people, that her cabin was to be well maintained, and that she was to be given certain privileges that extended far beyond what was typically granted to anyone in bondage. Neighbors speculated about the arrangement, of course. Speculation was the currency of rural communities, and a beautiful enslaved woman given visible preferential treatment was the kind of mystery that invited interpretation. Some whispered that Blackwood had developed an inappropriate attachment. Others suggested that Aura possessed skills that justified her separation. Perhaps she was a seamstress of particular talent, or a cook whose abilities were so refined that she required isolation to focus on her work. Still others offered darker suggestions, the kinds of implications that came with knowing glances and conversations that ended abruptly when others entered the room. What no one appeared to consider was that Aura might have orchestrated much of this herself. What no one had thought to ask was whether the isolation she seemed to have been given was actually a prison of her own design, or whether the privileges visible on the surface concealed an entirely different reality underneath. When Samuel Blackwood died unexpectedly in the spring of 1851, his death set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the cabin being opened for inspection. The plantation would be inventoried and sold. Every asset would be accounted for. Every person held in bondage would be assessed and listed. Aura, like every other human being on the property, would be cataloged, valued, and prepared for auction. It was during this process of documentation and preparation that someone finally entered the cabin with the intention of examining its contents thoroughly. The first investigator sent was a man named Thomas Garrett, a surveyor and property assessor hired to determine the value of everything on the estate. He was thorough in his work, methodical in his approach, and he prided himself on never missing details. When he walked through the door of Aura's cabin on a hot afternoon in June, he expected to find the typical furnishings of an enslaved person's dwelling. He anticipated a simple bed, perhaps a table, a few cooking implements, some basic clothing. What he encountered instead required him to stop, to step back outside, and to return with additional assistance. The cabin's interior was clean and orderly, but it contained far more than was typical. There were books, dozens of books, lined on shelves that had been carefully constructed along one wall. Books were forbidden. The education of enslaved people was a crime in Georgia, punishable by fine or imprisonment. The possession of books by an enslaved person could result in severe punishment. Yet here they were, volumes on history, literature, geography, mathematics, and philosophy. Many of them bore the markings of library sales, their pages worn from handling, their bindings cracked with age. Several contained handwritten notes in the margins, observations and questions written in a careful, precise hand. But the books were only the beginning. As Garrett moved deeper into the cabin, examining the structure more carefully, he began to notice inconsistencies. The interior dimensions seemed smaller than the exterior would suggest. There was space unaccounted for. He examined the walls more closely and discovered that the eastern wall contained a hidden compartment, carefully fitted and sealed with such precision that it would have been invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it. Behind this wall, folded carefully and preserved with what appeared to be great intentionality, were documents, letters, sketches, maps, and a journal bound in leather that had been treated with some substance to preserve it, its pages filled with handwriting that spanned several years. The journal began in 1844. The handwriting in those early entries was less controlled, more urgent. The author wrote of arrival, of the journey by wagon that took 2 days, of the first sight of the plantation stretching out beneath a gray sky. She wrote of the cabin with surprise, noting that it was cleaner than she had anticipated, that the overseer had explained she would be living separately from the others. She wrote of curiosity about why this arrangement had been made, and then, several entries later, of understanding. There was a man at the plantation, a carpenter and craftsman who maintained the property's buildings. His name was Marcus, and he had been enslaved on the property for 12 years. According to the early journal entries, Marcus had taken one look at Aura when she arrived, and everything had changed. The relationship that emerged from the pages of that journal was not simply a romance, though it contained elements of affection and intimacy. It was instead an alliance. Marcus had spent his 12 years on the plantation building relationships, earning trust through his reliable work, and carefully developing skills that went far beyond carpentry. He had taught himself to read through stolen moments with the overseer's discarded newspapers and magazines. He had developed an understanding of the property's layout, the patterns of supervision, the schedules of the people who maintained surveillance over the enslaved community. He had over time created a network of people, both enslaved and free, who moved information, materials, and occasionally people through carefully planned routes. When Aura arrived at the plantation, she arrived as a woman with her own skills and her own knowledge. She had been enslaved previously on a different property, where she had learned to manage a household, to handle finances, to read and write. Her literacy had been taught to her in secret by the mistress of her previous home, a woman who had begun to question the morality of slavery in her later years and had determined to leave some legacy of resistance in the women she trained. Aura had absorbed not just education, but also a philosophy of determined, careful resistance. The cabin that had seemed to observers to be a sign of Blackwood's inappropriate attachment was, in fact, something far different. It had been specifically requested by Marcus, who had convinced Blackwood that the quality of his work would improve if he were given an assistant. Someone to maintain his tools, to prepare his materials, to assist with the detailed work he undertook. Blackwood, who was primarily interested in the profits that Marcus's skills generated for the plantation, had agreed to the arrangement. He had allowed Marcus to oversee the construction of the cabin to ensure it met his specific requirements. And Marcus, with breathtaking audacity, had built into that cabin an entire infrastructure of resistance. The hidden compartment in the eastern wall was only the first of several spaces that Marcus had created. As investigators continued to examine the cabin more carefully with tools and with deliberate attention to the inconsistencies in measurement, they discovered more. There was a false bottom in the large wooden trunk that had been found in the corner of the main room. There was a section of the chimney that could be accessed from the interior, a space between the brick and the outer structure where items could be hidden and preserved. There was a compartment built into the base of the bed frame, sealed so carefully that would have been imperceptible to anyone sitting or lying on the surface. These were not spaces created for hoarding personal possessions or luxuries. These were spaces created for a specific purpose: the preservation and protection of written materials. The documents that were recovered from the cabin when it was finally opened completely told a story of extraordinary organizational capacity. There were manifests written in Marcus's careful hand, listing the names of enslaved people who had been moved to freedom through the networks he had helped to establish. There were route maps showing safe houses and hidden passages through the Georgia wilderness. There were letters from other enslaved people at neighboring plantations, describing conditions and expressing hope. There were astronomical charts and compass calculations, notes that would help someone traveling at night to navigate by the stars. And there were sketches, dozens of them drawn with an artist's hand. They depicted the plantations themselves, the locations of overseers' houses, the positions of guard dogs and monitoring stations. They showed routes through the properties, marked with annotations indicating which ways were typically patrolled and which were often unwatched. Some of these sketches appeared to be of plantations beyond Blackwood's property, suggesting that Marcus had somehow obtained knowledge of neighboring estates and had been compiling information about them for reasons that the investigators could only speculate about. The journal continued throughout these years, and it provided narrative context for the materials that surrounded it. Aura wrote about the work that she and Marcus were doing, though they never named it directly. She wrote about our efforts to record what should be remembered, and the collection of documents that will bear witness. She wrote about the danger of their work with clear-eyed awareness. She wrote about the punishments that would follow if they were discovered, and she wrote as though the discovery of their activities was not a possibility but an inevitability, a question not of if, but of when. What emerged from the careful reading of the journal and the examination of the documents was the understanding that the cabin had functioned as something more than a home. It had been an archive and a planning center for an underground network that extended far beyond the single plantation. The information that had been preserved there, the careful records and the maps and the letters, all of it suggested a sophisticated operation. This was not improvisation or spontaneous resistance. This was intentional, planned, and strategic work conducted over the course of 7 years with remarkable consistency and growing scope. The investigators who were examining the materials found themselves facing an uncomfortable reality. In their own time, in their own place, they had been confronted with evidence of organized resistance that challenged the fundamental narratives they had been taught about slavery. The enslaved people in the communities where they lived were not passive, not accepting, not resigned. They were planning, organizing, documenting, and creating networks that extended across property lines and involved people from multiple plantations working in concert with each other. The question that inevitably arose among the investigators was how long this network had existed before Aura's arrival. The documents that bore Marcus's handwriting suggested that his involvement in organized resistance had begun years before, but the scope and the sophistication appeared to increase dramatically after Aura joined the operation. Her literacy and her ability to forge documents, to create more complex written records, to keep the kind of detailed journal that required both time and security. All of this suggested that her arrival represented a significant expansion of the work. Attempts were made to trace the origins of the network through the materials in the cabin. Some of the letters found there were dated, and a few bore information about their origins. One letter was from a woman named Sarah who lived on a plantation in Alabama. Another was from a man named Jacob who worked in Charleston. A third came from someone identified only as the tailor in Savannah. These were not accidental contacts. They were part of what appeared to be a deliberately constructed communication network, each person positioned in a location that would have strategic value for facilitating movement or sharing information. The maps in the collection were perhaps the most revealing element of the entire operation. There were two main types of maps discovered in the cabin. The first type showed local geography, the areas surrounding the plantations in the region. These maps included marked routes and annotations, some in Marcus's hand and some in Aura's. The second type consisted of maps that appeared to show routes extending far beyond the local area. Some of these maps depicted routes northward, through the Carolinas into Virginia and beyond. Others showed routes westward, toward the Mississippi and beyond. A few showed routes toward the coast, potentially indicating sea routes or escape by water. One particularly detailed map showed a route extending all the way to Canada. The distance was marked in careful increments. The locations of cities and towns were noted. The notation, sympathetic contact, appeared at several points along the route. It became clear to the investigators that whoever had created these maps, whoever had been planning these routes, was thinking on a continental scale. This was not a local operation. This was connected to a much larger enterprise. The presence of Marcus as the organizing force behind this operation raised questions that the investigators struggled to address. How had an enslaved man in rural Georgia, without apparent travel or education, developed the sophistication to create such an operation? How had he built relationships with other people across such a wide geographic area? How had he obtained the materials and the knowledge necessary to create accurate maps and to understand the geography well enough to mark safe routes? The answers came from a closer examination of Marcus's background. In the plantation records that had been preserved, there was documentation that Marcus had been acquired 8 years prior from another plantation owner who was selling off property due to financial difficulties. The records noted that Marcus had been purchased as a skilled carpenter, indicating that his training had already been extensive before his arrival in Georgia. What the records did not note was that the plantation from which Marcus had been purchased was located in Charleston, a major port city. It was there, apparently, that he had begun to acquire the education and the connections that would later serve the network so well. The journal entries from Aura provided some additional context. She wrote of Marcus teaching her about the places he had known, the people he had encountered, the systems of assistance he had discovered during his earlier years. She wrote about his maps and his careful observation of the terrain. She wrote about listening to him describe the routes he had planned and the way his mind seemed to contain a vast geography of possibilities. She wrote with clear admiration for his work and his vision, and she wrote about her own contributions to the effort with a sense of purpose and clarity that came through, even in the formal language of her written words. One entry from 1847 was particularly revealing. Aura wrote, M. Mavish showed me today the plan for the expansion of the network. He has been working on this for months, gathering information from contacts in places I did not know existed until he told me about them. He speaks of a web that extends from Savannah to Pennsylvania, with threads running through the mountains and along the rivers. He told me that every thread is essential, that if one breaks, the web becomes weaker but does not disappear. He said that this is why we must be careful, but also why we must be ambitious. A small network can be discovered and destroyed. A large network, properly constructed, is far more resilient. This entry suggested that Marcus was thinking about the operation in terms of systems and resilience, in terms of building something that could survive the discovery and loss of individual elements. The cabin in Georgia was clearly one thread in a much larger web. If the cabin were discovered, if the documents were found, if Aura and Marcus were arrested, the web would be damaged but not destroyed. The information, the routes, the contacts, these had been carefully distributed so that the loss of any single node would not compromise the entire operation. Yet for all of the sophistication of the planning, for all of the care taken in hiding documents and preserving information, the fundamental vulnerability remained. Any person in the network could be discovered, interrogated, and forced to reveal information. The network existed only because the people involved in it were willing to take extraordinary risks, and because they trusted each other with information that could be used to destroy them all. The investigators began to ask questions about what had happened to Marcus and Aura. The plantation records show that Ora was still on the property at the time of Blackwood's death in 1851. But there was no record of what had become of her after the inventory of the estate had begun. The documents in the cabin ended in March of 1851, 3 months before Blackwood's death. The final entry in Ora's journal was dated March 15, 1851, and it read, "The decision has been made. M leaves with the next group. I will remain until the moment I can leave, preserving what must be preserved, preparing what must be prepared. What we have built here will outlast us. This is not an end. It is a transformation." The search through official records became more intensive as investigators tried to piece together what had happened in the months between the final journal entry and the opening of the cabin in June 1851. The plantation records indicated that Marcus had disappeared from the property sometime in April 1851. The overseer's log for that month contained a brief notation. Marcus, Carpenter Run. Loss estimated at $1,000. The entry was perfunctory, almost dismissive. A man valued at $1,000 had simply vanished, and the only record of the event was a single line indicating that the property owner would seek compensation if the enslaved man was captured and returned. But the circumstances of Marcus's departure, when considered in light of the documents found in the cabin and the final journal entry, suggested something far more deliberate. The manifests that had been discovered in the hidden compartments listed dates and names of people who had been moved northward. Several of these dates fell in the month of April 1851, and the final entry on one of the manifests was dated April 12, 1851, just days after the overseer had recorded Marcus's disappearance. The entry read, "M and 7 others departed toward Station 3. All safe, God willing." The handwriting on this entry was different from Marcus's usual script, suggesting that someone else had made the final notation. This raised the possibility that Marcus's disappearance had not been an emergency flight but a planned departure. He had been part of the network he had created, and his own removal from the property may have been engineered as a test of the system he had built, or as a necessary transition once the security of his position had been compromised. The fact that 7 other people had departed at the same time suggested that his leave-taking had been coordinated with a larger movement operation. The remaining months between Marcus's departure and the opening of the cabin in June were a period of profound uncertainty. Ora remained on the property, apparently performing her duties as she had for the previous 7 years. The overseer's logs make no mention of her. There are no notations about any unusual behavior or any suspicions about her involvement in Marcus's disappearance. She appears to have been invisible, recorded in administrative documents only by her existence in the property inventory and the assignment of her labor to various tasks. During this time, apparently, she was engaged in a final phase of the work. The documents in the cabin suggested that she was making copies of the most important materials, preserving them in the hidden compartments that Marcus had built. The final entries in the journal, written in those last months, show a woman engaged in methodical preservation work. She wrote about selecting which documents were most essential, about creating duplicates of the maps, about organizing the letters and manifests in ways that would allow them to be found and understood by someone coming after her. One entry from May 1851 showed Ora reflecting on the work. "If these documents are discovered, I pray that whoever finds them will understand what they represent. They are not merely papers written on pages. They are the crystallized hopes of people who believed that freedom was possible. They are the geographic representation of human determination. They are evidence of a love that transcended the boundaries that were meant to keep us apart and constrain us to isolation. If we are caught, if this work is destroyed, others will come after us. The network will rebuild. The maps will be redrawn. The vision will persist. And then on June 3, 1851, the final entry. I see the men coming to take inventory. I know what will follow. But something cannot be inventoried, cannot be owned, cannot be sold to the highest bidder. This thought sustains me today. Whatever happens, that which is written here will remain. Long after I am gone, these words will exist. This is not a small thing. This is everything. Aura's disappearance, when it occurred, happened during the inventory process. The official records indicated that she was alive and on the property when the assessment work began in late May. By the time the evaluation of her property and person was set to occur, in early July she was gone. No overseer's log recorded her escape. No official documents noted the loss of her labor or attempted to estimate her monetary value for compensation purposes. She seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving behind only the archive that she and Marcus had created, hidden in the cabin that had been their home and their headquarters. The investigators' attempts to trace what had become of Aura through other official channels proved largely fruitless. Some searches were conducted through records of newly acquired enslaved people in northern states, though the likelihood of finding her was remote. She would almost certainly have changed her name or moved beyond the documented channels of slave sales and acquisitions. A few tantalizing clues emerged. In 1855, a woman matching Aura's description was noted in the records of an abolitionist organization in Philadelphia. She was listed as a lecturer and speaker on the topics of slavery and resistance, and she apparently traveled extensively, telling her story to audiences throughout the North and the Midwest. If this woman was indeed Aura, then her journey had taken her from the isolated cabin in Georgia to the platform as a public intellectual and activist. She had moved from hidden resistance to visible opposition, from archiving the work of others to becoming herself a subject worth listening to. Some of the evidence suggested that she had eventually traveled to Canada, where records from that period are less complete and less reliable. But the possibility remained that she had managed to escape the property, that she had followed the routes that Marcus had so carefully mapped out, and that she had found safety in a place where she could work openly for the cause of freedom. The broader implications of the documents found in the cabin began to emerge as scholars and historians started to engage with them more seriously. The operation that Marcus and Aura had been running was not isolated. The letters and manifests in the collection referenced other operations, other networks, other people doing similar work in other places. When combined with historical records from other sources, the documents painted a picture of organized, systematic resistance that was far more extensive than most historical accounts had acknowledged. The scholars who examined the materials noted several remarkable features of the operation. First, the record-keeping was extraordinary. Most underground resistance networks of this era left very little documentation. Deliberately so, because written records were dangers that could be used as evidence in trials, or could reveal the names and locations of people involved. Yet Marcus and Aura had deliberately created extensive written records and had preserved them carefully. This suggested a conscious intention to create a historical record to ensure that future generations would have testimony about what had occurred and how the work had been organized. Second, the maps themselves represented a form of knowledge that was normally restricted to white men of education and means. The ability to create accurate geographic representations to understand scale and distance, to plan routes based on topographic features. These were skills associated with professional cartographers, surveyors, and military strategists. The fact that Marcus had developed these skills, or had learned them, represented a deliberate transgression against the educational restrictions that were meant to contain enslaved people within boundaries of ignorance. Third, the network that the documents revealed was not based on the kind of dramatic escape narratives that had become familiar through abolitionist literature. There were no accounts of dramatic confrontations or last-minute saves. Instead, what emerged was a system based on careful planning, distributed resources, and methodical movement. The manifest that recorded the departure of enslaved people noted not panic or desperation, but orderly transitions from one location to the next, with safe houses prepared in advance and contacts ready to receive people and move them forward. The system bore a striking resemblance in its organization and structure to modern humanitarian networks designed to move people safely through dangerous territory. The question that historians began to ask was whether this network, and others like it, had been far more substantial and organized than the existing historical record acknowledged. The traditional history of slavery and resistance had emphasized the dramatic, the famous escapes, the rebellions, the prominent figures who had risked everything for freedom. But the documents from the cabin suggested a different kind of history, one of careful, systematic work conducted by people whose names would never be widely known, whose contributions would remain largely invisible unless and until their records were discovered. When the documents were finally made public, decades after their discovery, they generated considerable debate among historians about the extent and sophistication of organized resistance networks during the slavery era. Some scholars argued that the documents provided clear evidence that enslaved people had developed remarkably sophisticated means of resistance and escape organization. Others cautioned against reading too much into the materials, arguing that the network that Marcus and Ora had documented was exceptional and should not be interpreted as representative of more widespread patterns. What was undeniable was that the documents provided a window into a world of organized activity that had been largely invisible in the historical record. They showed enslaved people not as passive victims, but as active agents working to undermine the system that held them in bondage. They showed careful planning, strategic thinking, and a willingness to take extraordinary risks for the sake of freedom. And they showed, perhaps most importantly, the deep love and commitment that had bound together the people who participated in this work. The journal entries between Marcus and Ora, preserved in the careful archive of the cabin, documented not just resistance, but an extraordinary relationship of partnership and trust. Marcus and Ora worked together, planned together, took risks together, and ultimately were separated by the very system they had worked so hard to undermine and transcend. Their story, revealed through the documents they had carefully preserved, became a testament to human resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming oppression. The investigators who had initially opened the cabin in June 1851 had not fully understood what they had discovered. They had been looking for property to be inventoried and sold. Instead, they had found evidence of activities that, if acted upon, could have resulted in criminal charges being brought against living people. The discovery had created a delicate situation. The authorities had to decide what to do with the materials that had been found. Some officials argued that the documents should be destroyed. They posed a danger, this argument went, because they could be used to identify members of the network who might still be active or who might still be residing on plantations in the region. The detailed maps and manifests could potentially be used to locate safe houses and to identify sympathetic contacts who had assisted in the movement of enslaved people. From a security perspective, from the point of view of those who benefited from the slavery system, the documents represented a threat that should be eliminated. But other officials took a different view. They argued that the documents were valuable as evidence that might be used to track down and apprehend the people who had escaped through this network. The maps could be used to identify locations where fugitives might have gone. The manifests could provide names, though many were coded or gave only first names, that might help in conducting searches. The letters might reveal the identities of free people or northerners who had been complicit in assisting enslaved people to escape. From this perspective, the documents were not a threat but a resource. A third faction suggested that the documents be preserved, not for the purpose of apprehending the people involved, but for the historical record. This was the smallest faction, and their arguments had little force in a society that was actively working to suppress and deny the extent of resistance to slavery. But the suggestion was made nonetheless that these materials documented something significant, something worth preserving for future generations to understand. In the end, the decision made was a compromise of sorts. The documents would be preserved, but they would be kept out of public circulation. They would be stored in a secure location, cataloged and documented by the authorities, but not made available for general inspection. The intention was that these materials would be controlled, kept in the hands of the government, available only for purposes that the government deemed appropriate. The documents would be preserved, but they would be imprisoned, held in official custody, much as the people who had created them had been held in captivity. For decades, the documents remained in storage, occasionally accessed by historians who had somehow learned of their existence and who possessed the connections necessary to gain permission to examine them. But the broader public, the wider world of historical scholarship, remained largely unaware of what had been discovered in the cabin in Georgia in 1851. The materials were referred to in some scholarly works, but often in veiled or coded language that obscured their significance. The full truth of what Marcus and Aura had built remained unknown to most people. It was not until the 20th century, well after the end of slavery and the passage of more than 100 years since the cabin had been first opened, that the documents became more widely available. Even then, their release was not unopposed. Some descendants of the plantation-owning families involved argued that the release of the materials was an invasion of privacy, that the documents contained sensitive information about their ancestors that should remain confidential. But these arguments failed. The logic of historical scholarship and the principle that such materials represented important evidence of American history proved stronger than the desire to protect the reputations of people long dead. When the documents finally entered the public sphere, when scholars and the general public could read Aura's journal and examine Marcus's maps and review the carefully preserved letters and manifests, the impact was substantial. The materials that had been hidden in the cabin and then hidden by the government, brought to light at last, challenged the way that American history had been understood and taught. They demonstrated that resistance to slavery had been far more extensive, far more organized, and far more sophisticated than the historical narrative had previously acknowledged. The life that Aura lived, the work that she had done, the words that she had written and carefully preserved, These became part of the historical record. And with that inclusion came a fuller, richer understanding of the American past, an understanding that included not just the oppression and suffering that slavery had imposed, but also the determination, courage, and creativity of the people who had resisted it. The architectural significance of the cabin itself became clearer as historians and researchers examined the structure more thoroughly. Marcus's construction of the hidden compartments had been accomplished with remarkable skill and sophistication. The false walls were fitted so precisely that they would have been virtually invisible to someone not specifically looking for them. The compartment in the chimney had been constructed in a way that did not compromise the structural integrity or the function of the chimney itself. The concealment of the space beneath the bed had been done so carefully that the bed had remained perfectly usable with no indication that there was anything hidden beneath it. This level of construction skill was not surprising, given that Marcus had been trained as a carpenter. But the specificity of the design suggested that he had had experience in creating hidden spaces before. Some historians speculated that he might have learned these techniques during his time in Charleston, where his skills as a craftsman would have been valuable and where there might have been connections to people who had experience in creating refuge spaces. Whether this was the case or not, the physical structure of the cabin served as testimony to Marcus's ingenuity and his ability to think in 3 dimensions about space and concealment. The materials themselves that had been preserved in the cabin told stories about the networks of support that existed around the operation. Some of the letters found in the hidden compartments had been written on paper that was relatively expensive, suggesting that they had come from people who had resources. Other materials appear to have been written on scrap paper, backs of official documents, or other materials that had been repurposed. This suggested that the network included people of varying economic circumstances, that support for resistance work came from both people of means and people of very limited resources. Several of the letters were written in hands that were clearly educated, the penmanship suggesting training and practice. Other letters were written in hands that were less skilled, the letters irregular and sometimes difficult to read, suggesting that the writers had learned to write without formal instruction or had learned relatively recently. This diversity of literacy levels suggested that the network did not exclude people based on education or refinement, that people from all backgrounds and circumstances could participate in the work of resistance. One of the most poignant discoveries was a packet of letters written from Aura to Marcus, bundled together with ribbon and preserved carefully in one of the hidden compartments. These letters appeared to have been separated from Marcus's other belongings at some point and returned to the cabin, perhaps sent back through the network after Marcus had escaped. They were personal in nature, expressing Aura's feelings toward Marcus, her hopes for their future together, her fears about what might happen to them if they were discovered. One letter in particular stood out. In it, Aura described a moment when she and Marcus had stood together outside the cabin, looking out toward the property and the wider world beyond. She wrote, "You showed me the map yesterday, the one that extends all the way to Canada. When I look at those lines and those markings, I did not see only a route that might carry us to safety. I saw a representation of human possibility. Those lines showed all of the places where help might be found, all of the people who had decided that human freedom was worth supporting, worth risking for. When I trace my finger along those routes, I feel connected to all of those people, to their courage and their commitment. I feel less alone. and I feel for the first time in my life that freedom might be something achievable, something real enough to plan for and work toward. This letter revealed not just the emotional connection between Marcus and Aura, but also the way that they understood their work. They were not simply trying to escape slavery for themselves, they were working towards something larger, something that involved transforming the system itself by creating alternatives to it, by demonstrating through their actions that freedom was possible. The maps and the networks and the careful organization were not just means to personal escape. They were expressions of a vision of a different kind of world. The investigation of the cabin and its contents eventually led researchers to attempt to trace the larger network that Marcus and Aura had been part of. One of the most valuable elements in this research was the list of names that appeared in the manifest. Though many were coded or gave only first names, some were complete, and cross-referencing these names with other historical documents and records sometimes revealed information about who these people were and what had become of them. Several of the people named in the manifests appeared in public records after 1851. Some appeared in abolitionist records as speakers or activists. Others appeared in records of Black communities in northern states. A few appeared in records of settlement in Canada. The existence of these traces suggested that the network had successfully moved people to safety, and that at least some of those people had gone on to live relatively stable lives in freedom. One woman mentioned in the manifest, listed only as E in Marcus's records, appears in newspaper archives from 1860 as a schoolteacher in Ohio. Another person listed as S, the blacksmith, appears in census records from 1870 in Pennsylvania, listed as a free laborer. A third, R, the musician, appears in the records of a Black church in Boston in 1858, listed as a choir director. These were not famous people, not widely known figures in the history of resistance and abolition,